Hey scholars, today we are going to be learning a little bit more about the Earth, and we're going to introduce some important vocabulary that we're going to use over the next couple days as we start to learn about the different ways that Earth moves. So to get started, you will need your notes for today glued into your notebook. We can start by adding the date at the top. And we'll start with our I can statement. So I can identify Earth's northern and southern hemispheres and explain that Earth rotates on a tilted axis. So we heard a couple important vocabulary words that we're going to learn more about today, including the hemispheres and that the Earth is tilted and it rotates on its axis. Okay? So first off, we need to know that Earth is on a tilted axis. An axis is an imaginary line around which an object rotates or spins. So when you picture the Earth, chances are you just picture the beautiful planet, circular, spherical, okay? But what we need to keep in mind is that even though here in this image it looks like there's a pole going through the center of the Earth, that's actually an imaginary line, and we call it the axis, and it is important to know that term and to know that, if you notice, it's not standing up straight or upright. It's tilted on its side. So again, some important vocabulary to help us preview what we're learning today. Axis is an invisible line around which an object rotates or spins. And then tilt or tilted means leaning in one direction, which it means it's not straight or upright. So in our notes, we can start by saying an axis is an imaginary. So again, it's not a real pole that cuts through the center. It's an imaginary line around which an object rotates or spins. And while we're here, we can also say Earth's axis is, what's that word that goes here to describe the lean of the Earth? We're going to write tilted. Whoops. Earth's axis is tilted, and that means it's not standing straight up and down, it is tilted or leaning to one side. And here's a good example for you to keep in mind what tilted means. So in the first image, you've got Earth standing up tall and a straight line from top to bottom. So this is what would be considered no tilt, and this is actually not the right way to picture the Earth. We need to keep in mind that even though it feels like we're standing upright, the Earth is actually tilted, and this tilt is really important, especially as we learn about seasons. So the Earth is tilted, which means it's leaning to one side, and we've got the axis cutting through the center, the imaginary line. So some of you might be wondering, well, what caused the Earth to tilt? Why is it not straight up and down or upright? Why is it tilted? And that's because long, long ago, when Earth was very young, we think that something big actually hit or collided with Earth and knocked it off kilter or knocked it off its upright. So instead of rotating with this axis straight up and down, it leans over a little bit. And that thing that we said that knocked into Earth was called Theia. And that was just a really large space object. And we also know that it blasted a big hole in the surface, and that big hit sent a large amount of dust and rubble into orbit, and many scientists think that our moon was at one time a piece of that rubble that broke off. So in this little cartoon image, it shows the Earth, this large space object called Theia that collides. Notice all the debris, all the little pieces that break off, and scientists think that one of these little pieces then became our moon, which is really just a rock. So as Earth orbits the sun, its tilted axis always points in the same direction. So throughout the year, different parts of the Earth get the sun's direct rays. And again, we talked about how the tilt is really connected to why we have different seasons, why our weather changes throughout the year, and we'll talk about that a lot more next week. So the next big vocabulary term we need to be familiar with is thinking about the Earth as a sphere. And the sphere is cut in half. Now we know the Earth is not really cut in half, but we want to pretend it's cut in half with an imaginary line, and we'll talk about what that line is called in just a second. Maybe you already know, the line that goes through the center of the Earth. But when we split it in half, we are left with the northern, the top hemisphere, the northern hemisphere, and below that imaginary line where it's cut in half is the southern hemisphere. And hemisphere is just a fancy word to describe half of the planet. So hemisphere actually means half of a sphere. In this case, the sphere we're talking about is the Earth, and that imaginary line that I mentioned before, now you can see, is the line called the equator. And again, we've got the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So we'll start in our notes. The Earth is divided into two hemispheres. And we know that's the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And what we just read is that hemisphere means half. Hemi means half of a sphere, and in this case the sphere we're talking about is the Earth. All right, we'll let that refocus. All right. Let's see if I can get this to show the bottom half of our paper. There we go. All right, so coming back down here, an imaginary line that separates the northern and southern hemispheres, that line is called the equator. And I know you guys have talked about that a little bit with Miss Esser too. So think about where we live in regards to the northern and southern hemispheres. Do you have a prediction? Do you think we live in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? See what we have here. We live in the, well, if you're looking at this map, at the globe, we can see this continent here is North America, and North America is going to be in the northern hemisphere. So therefore, we live in the northern hemisphere. So we can fill in the sentence here, we live in the northern hemisphere. I know it can be kind of confusing because you probably hear people say, oh, we live in the south, but that's talking about the southeast of the United States. But if we're talking about the globe as a whole, our continent, North America, is actually on the northern hemisphere, the top half of the Earth. The southern hemisphere is going to be continents like Australia, South America, those that are below the equator. So the last thing we're going to do to review what we've learned today is draw a model that's going to help us remember some of those different terms we got today. So thinking about the Earth as a sphere. Remember, sphere is a circular shape when it's flat on paper. When it's a 3D shape, it's like a ball. So we're going to draw a quick model of the Earth labeling those different terms we talked about. So if we've got the Earth, the first thing we're going to add on is the axis. And notice I'm drawing it slanted. It's not straight up and down because we know our axis is on a tilt. The next thing I'm going to do is draw the equator. And we can label it. And the reason we want to know about the equator is because it separates the northern, N for northern, S for southern hemisphere. Okay, while we're here, let's go ahead and add a label to show this is the axis. And again, keeping in mind that I drew it kind of crooked on purpose because we need to remember that our axis is tilted, meaning the Earth does not stand up straight or upright. So this is where we'll stop today for our notes. Again, the main words we've got today are axis, equator, and knowing the northern and southern hemisphere. At this time, you'll go ahead and continue working through your Nearpod.